to, throughout the talk, ask questions, make points, make suggestions, criticize, challenge, agree, yawn, whatever you want to do. The reason for this is that I realized, you know when you've got a question in your head, and then the lecturer is just like talking, and then you're waiting till the end for them to answer that question. It's hard to concentrate on the rest of the stuff. If there's something cooking in your head, you're like, that question, I'm not sure what the answer is. So, the more you guys interact, the more we're actually going to learn, and also the quicker we're going to get through the actual content. Now, is everyone okay with that? Yes. It's like one person. Everyone okay with that? Okay, fantastic. So, firstly, how many people have seen this picture before? 1, 2, 3. Okay, pretty much everyone, except for my brother here. Everyone else has seen this picture. What does this picture represent? You don't need to raise your hand, just,
The evolution of man.
Sorry?
The evolution of
The evolution of man. Fantastic. Okay. Where have you seen this picture?
GCSE textbooks.
GCSE textbook. Excellent. Other than that, have you seen it anywhere else?
A-level textbooks.
Okay.
Selfish gene.
I'm going to assume what your answer is going to be next. Where else have you seen this?
You said selfish gene.
Selfish gene. Adverts.
Yeah.
TV adverts. There's this thing about evolution. Yeah. You get these sort of, a few years ago, this beer commercial, which you get this, this evolution sort of thing. There's that music video a few years ago called Fat Boy Slim or something, which had that guy, that thing that was evolving. In the end, it became like a human. Then the human became like really fat, sat on a bench. Anyone remember that? Yes. How can you listen to you? That's how you cast them out. So you see, this particular picture is well ingrained in the minds of all of us. Yeah? We all seem to recognize this picture. Now, you could be from a dusty village in the Sahara Desert, and chances are that if you've had some interaction with the outside world, and say if you happen to have a mobile phone, you have Facebook, and you have some sort of social media, chances are you've come across this picture. Now, this picture is as iconic for Darwin's theory of evolution as it is the case that Coca-Cola has the red and white sort of stripy logo. However, consider that a picture which is accepted by everyone as a understanding of how Darwin's theory actually works. What if I told you this picture was wrong? It was flat out wrong. In fact, it is actually called by some evolutionary biologists as a bastardization of Darwin's theory, which has nothing to do with Darwin, but to do with people who came after him. And if I was to tell you that philosophers of biology and evolutionary biologists say this is not the way that the theory works. Okay. How would that make you feel that something that you really thought this is how the theory works, it turns out to be flat out wrong? How does it make you feel?
Stupid.
Stupid. Okay, that's a bit harsh. But it makes you feel a bit surprised, right? You're kind of like, I've been misled here. This is a bit confusing, I thought this is the way the theory works, and this isn't actually the way it works. So what's going on here? So the reason why I put this slide up first is to show you guys there's a big difference between the public understanding of the theory and the academic understanding. Okay? This picture is a picture of progress. There's a progression from a chimp-like ancestor to a Homo sapien. However, there is nothing in Darwin's theory that is about organisms progressing to more and more complexity, and you have this type of linear progression. This isn't actually what Darwin believed. This isn't actually Darwin's own view. This is actually the view of a German biologist who outlived Darwin, or was one of Darwin's fans, Ernst Haeckel from Germany. So you have the likes of, say, Henry Guy, who is a paleontologist and evolutionary biologist, and he's the senior editor of the scientific journal Nature. Anyone heard of that journal? Right? Now, you have scientific journals where scientists publish their works, and the most prestigious journal in the world is actually Nature. It is based in King's Cross, and it's, I believe, also the oldest journal in the world. And he's the senior editor of Nature in his book, The Accidental Species. Henry Guy takes this picture and basically says, this is not the way the theory works, this is a public misconception. Likewise, the philosopher of science, and before I speak about philosophers, if we are here to talk about Darwin's theory, and I mentioned to you, this scientist said this scientist said this, and then I mentioned a philosopher said this. Why am I mentioning the philosophers? Why are they important here? Is it because they need something to do? Because they don't have anything to do? Or why is it important to mention what the philosophy of science has to say about this?
Is it because philosophy normally extrapolates something to very sort of fundamental grounds, like it asks very basic questions?
Yeah.
Science often sort of doesn't see, because science is more to do with, like, to ask bigger questions, and it kind of often forgets the foundations of questioning
Yeah.
the very foundations of the
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a very good answer. So imagine I'm a scientist and I'm looking through and I'm studying bacteria. Bacteria are the organisms that I am studying. And a philosopher is standing back here and staring at me, and his study organism is the scientist. So he's looking at how the scientist is using their observations to come up with the theories and the hypotheses. So if you like, science is at one level, and the philosophy of science is at one level above. Is that clear, or am I speaking Chinese? Clear? Okay, excellent. So what we're going to cover today is the relationship between science and certainty, the state of Darwin's theory, the existence of God and Darwinian evolution, why Darwinian evolution is unique, okay? Why Darwinian evolution is unlike any theory in the history of science. And lastly, a little bit about Islam and science. Okay. So, I'm going to mention something very important now. All throughout the lecture, I'm going to be repeating the same narrative. Because this isn't a class in philosophy, this isn't a class in biology, this is a class in unbrainwashing. Yeah? I'm going to speak about the difference between the public understanding and the academic understanding. The public understanding and the academic understanding. Right? And there's a big difference between the two. There's a big difference between what you've been taught and what's the reality. At the end of the lecture, I will then explain why there's the difference between the public and the academic. Yeah? So throughout the talk you may be thinking, hang on, what's going on, what's going on, what's going on? Why is there such a big difference between what we've been taught and what's the reality? That is something I'm going to answer right near the end. Okay. So the people I'm going to be speaking about today, what we'll be referencing, I'm not going to be speaking about somebody who believes in intelligent design or believes that God created everything, a creationist of any sort. I'm not going to be speaking about people who are like that. I'm going to be speaking from the perspective of mainstream evolutionary biologists who are secular, who believe in naturalism, who believe in natural causation, and I'm referring to peer-reviewed scientific journals. That's not Monica Lewinsky, by the way, if anybody's worried about that picture. Okay, what is science? Science is misunderstood, and science is something about which philosophers lose a lot of sleep. So I'm not going to get into the philosophical discussion about what is science, because there is no consensus. What I am going to get into is the basic understanding of science, which is that you ask a question, you do some background research, you construct a hypothesis, you test it. If that hypothesis, repeatedly after testing it, it's doing well, then you get elevated to a theory, and that theory is scientific. So that's basically science. Why is science amazing? Because it works. So if you were to make a prediction using Newtonian mechanics and say, there is this planet, where is this planet going to be in 6 months' time, based upon these equations, and you were to do your calculations, and then you come up with a result, and then you go out there after 6 months, and you go and observe, the planet will be where you predicted it to be. So it works. And it is something which has changed the way that we think about our relationship with the world. It is something which impacts all of us, from the time that we wake up in the morning and we check our WhatsApp till the time that we fall asleep at night, and you have, censored lights and all these sorts of things. So science impacts every aspect of our lives, and it works. However, there's some misconceptions about science, and one of the misconceptions is that science gives you certainty. Science is there to give you facts about the world which are absolute, not going to change, and that can't be revised. So this can't be right, and the reason why it can't be right is because of the way that scientific theories are constructed. So I'm a scientist, say, and I need to discover what is the colour of swans. So I go out there in the world, I collect data, I say, right, all the swans I've seen so far, of the 100 are white. I do another sample, the next 100 are white, the next 100 are white, the next 100 are white. And then after maybe going through 10,000 observations of swans from this limited set of 10,000, I make a generalization for all swans, the infinite set. And I say, because I've observed about 10,000 white swans, all swans are white. Or I make a prediction, the next one I'm going to see is white. So that scientific theory is well supported by the evidence. However, if I see a black swan, that black swan is going to challenge my theory that all swans are white. This is known as the problem of induction. And this is an ancient problem which goes back to the philosopher David Hume. And it's a general problem in knowledge, it's a general problem that you can always have a new data set which can challenge your previous theory. But remember, scientific theories are a lot more complex than this. This is very, very simple. But at a rudimentary, simple level, if a black swan can challenge 10,000 observations, then what about something which is much more complex when we talk about the beginning of the universe or the beginning of life, or we're speaking about another broad theory, like string theory or whatever. So that's the first reason why science cannot give you certainty. It's because of the black swan problem. You can always have a future observation which challenges your previous theory. Okay. As I mentioned in the beginning, if you don't agree with anything I say, just raise your hand. I'm not going to, shout you down or anything. So, as I'm going through these presentations, if there's something you don't understand or if there's something you disagree with, please speak up. The second reason why science is not certain in its conclusions is because of what I've tried to explain as the scattergraph problem. The actual name in philosophy of science is underdetermination of scientific theory by observation. It's a bit of a jargon word. So rather than using underdetermination, I thought I'd explain it like this. So you have a set of data scattered on the graph. Now you're asked to make a line of best fit. Now you can make a sort of straight line, or you can make a line going the other way, or you can make an exponential curve, or you can make like a sine curve. The same data gives rise to multiple different interpretations. Now, as scientists, what they have to do is they have to stick to the simplest or stick to one. They can't just say, you know, we can't make up our minds, we're not going to carry on with anything. They have to stick to one. But the same data can give rise to alternative theories. Okay, question time. What if somebody says, well, you can't apply this to Darwin's theory because it has too much evidence? Sorry?
What's the evidence?
Say they have. Alright, good question. So they say, oh, you know, that green dot is genetic data, that is biochemical sequence that we predicted, that's your natural selection in moths. You know, you've got all this. Forget what the details are. They're saying we have data, and this data only gives rise to one interpretation. How will you challenge that conceptually, even if you don't know science?
Can you potentially bring out outliers, something which sort of disagrees with the scientific facts?
Yes, you can do that. Very good point. Apart from that, but that's going into the science. How can you do that even if you don't know anything, even if you don't know anything about science?
When you talk about that person who developed the idea for working from one species to another, so if he was using the same evidence, then you have two different interpretations.
Yes, exactly. This, whether it's Darwin's theory, or it's string theory, or it's the theory about Lady Gaga, reality is the same data can give you alternative hypotheses, alternative theories, alternative inferences. That's just a basic fact of life. Now, if someone wants to come along and say that's not true, what they're doing is they're just up against a brick wall, because whether we know the science of any theory or we don't, that fact remains. The same data can give rise to alternative theories. Interestingly enough, another question, who was the first biologist to say the same data that we are actually studying right now, to come up with Darwin's theory, we can actually come up with a theory which is alternative to Darwin? Which was the first scientist who said that? Golden egg, for whoever gets the answer right. I can't give out the egg because the eggs are bitter and Easter.
No.
Darwin, excellent. Darwin himself said this. Where did he say this?
Is it the origin of species?
It was the origin of species. In the origin of species, Darwin, right at the beginning, said this. The same data that I have in my book, the same facts, they can give rise to a theory which is different to mine, which is alternative to mine. However, a real answer we can get when we can compare all of these alternatives to try and come up with the most simplest or the best. However, I still think my theory is right. So I'm paraphrasing what he said there. Darwin admitted that the same data that he has in the origin can give rise to an alternative to his own, although he believed his was right. Two main reasons why science changes: novel observations and alternative theories. Novel observations, meaning new observations which can challenge your previous theory, which is known as the black swan problem, and alternative theories based on the same data, which is known as the scatter graph problem. Okay, wait, jump the gun there. So, someone says, okay, I disagree. Science does give you facts. Who's an easy victim? Are you an easy victim? What's your name? Farhan. Okay. Farhan. No, of course science. Are you saying science changes? Or are you saying that science gives you facts? What do you believe?
Science changes.
Science changes. Okay. Well, the shape of the earth is not going to change. What about the fact that dinosaur fossils exist? Or what about the fact that DNA is a code? Or what about the fact that the Earth goes around the sun? These are going to change for a moment, are they?
The fundamentals of science somewhat are based on unchanged things that can be observed, but theories change.
Okay, so that means that what you initially said was incorrect. You said science changes as a general statement. Now you're saying theories can change, but the smaller stuff doesn't, like observations don't change. So you change your mind.
Theories become science.
Sorry?
But science is theories, isn't it?
Yeah.
So surely, like, if theories can change, science can change too.
Yeah, but I quoted out on something else. I said, look, the shape of the Earth, right?
Yeah.
Or the Earth going around the sun. Yes?
If we look through the history over the years, people have said that in the past, people have said that shape of the Earth was a square or it was a flat, and over the years, then they said it was round, then they said it was flat again. So it has changed over the years. So it does change.
I'm not sure if that makes sense because we can't say something in the future is going to be discovered which is going to show that this fossil I have in front of me doesn't exist or the shape of the Earth is not round because we've gone to space and observed that. Unless the Flat Earth Society is doing well in Birmingham, I'm assuming you guys do believe the Earth is round. But I bet the Flat Earth Society is doing quite good, globally. Don't know why, but even a good friend of mine who's got a degree in physics from UCL believes the Earth is flat. So it's doing quite well, but that's just a side point. There's nothing in the future that we can observe that will show that this fossil doesn't exist, or stars don't exist, or the Milky Way galaxy isn't a galaxy. It's easy.
So basically, reality won't change even if science is changing. Like if you made an observation that if something is real, it's still going to stay there, but your observation and interpretation of things can change. And but it doesn't mean that just because it can change, you reach the wrong conclusion. Like you may have reached the right conclusion.
So would you say, okay, here's some science, yeah? Here's a fossil. The fossil is a trilobite, which lived 300 million years ago, right here. I've seen those fossils, right? So, is there something in the future that's going to change the fact that there's a fossil here of a trilobite? So science doesn't change.
It doesn't necessarily change, but it can change.
Okay, so now what's happened is, initially you guys were defending the idea science changes, but now you're saying it doesn't have to change, but it can. So you've gone from certainty to probability.
I'm going to go with science does change based on the observations. Observations stay as observations, but science is an interpretation of observations.
MashaAllah.
Green circle there, we all agree that it's green. But someone might come in 5 years' time and be like, that's not actually green, it's blue, and convince everyone that it's blue.
Right, okay, I don't agree with that part. See, there's a fine line between intelligence and sanity. Sanity is overrated, isn't it? So, what you're saying is actually right in the first part, is that observations are observations. Observations are not science. They're just observations. Science is when you take an observation and then you construct a theory. A theory is science, an observation is not science. So the shape of the Earth is not science. The shape of the Earth is the shape of the Earth. A fossil is not science, it's just a fossil. A star is not science, it's just a star. Okay, looking at stars, if I was to look at stars, I could come up with the science of astronomy. Yay or nay? Yay? One person, yay or nay, guys? Yay, yeah? What if I was to use the stars and come up with astrology? Is that science? Yay or nay? Nay.
What's the difference? Astrology is interpretation.
Okay, what's the difference between astrology and astronomy? Who's going to help me answer? What's the difference between astronomy and astrology?
Astrology is like you say
So, seems to be, let the brothers complete what he's saying. Yes.
so astrology
I'll come to you in a second.
is using the stars to predict the future, for example.
That's astronomy or astrology?
Astrology.
Yep.
And astronomy is using the stars to predict the patterns of where the stars are going to go, where the planets are going to go.
Okay, excellent. Sister, what were you going to say?
Both of them are using observation,
Yes.
but astrology does it in scientific method.
Yes.
So, yeah, astrology, they still predict where the stars are going.
Yeah.
But their interpretation, so for example, retrograde, for thousands of years, retrograde is seen as a magical event. Because they didn't understand how Mars could appear to go backwards. But now we know that's because it's going out at a different speed through scientific method.
Yeah.
So while they still observe it, they can still say, oh, that's going to do that. Their reasoning behind it is not scientific because they don't decide.
Yeah. And like you said, what's common between both of them is they're both using observations. One's using stars and coming up with astrology, which is not science. One is using stars as observations and coming up with astronomy. The stars themselves are not astrology, nor are they astronomy. They're not science themselves, they're just observations. Using observations, you can come up with science. Using observations, you can come up with pseudoscience. Right? So observations themselves are not science. So when somebody says to you, science is true because we know the shape of the earth is not going to change, we know that water is H2O, we know fossils exist, we know that DNA is a code. They're using observations and they're pretending like this is science. Observations is not science. Observations are just observations. You can use them to come up with science, you can use them to come up with pseudoscience like astrology, but this is a common confusion. Yeah, it's like somebody falls on the floor and starts visiting and stuff and has a spasm, and I say, is there a doctor in the house? And then the sister comes down and says, I'm a doctor. And then I say, help him out, sister. And she says, I've got PhD in philosophy. She's like, I asked for a doctor, yeah, a medical doctor, not PhD. These are two different things. A PhD in philosophy will make you a doctor. A medical degree will make you a doctor. These are two different things. Science is not observations. Science is when observations are used to come up with theories. So if someone tries to say, no, science changes because of observations, then science doesn't change because of observations, then you tell them, no. Observations are observations, they're not science. Science is when you use them to come up with a theory. Science is more than just observation. If you look at the scientific method, they are a part of coming up with a theory. They are not the theory itself. Yeah? Okay. Now the fact that science changes is well known and understood in the history of science. It's not a controversial thing that science changes. Right? Well-known theories can change. Well-substantiated theories can change. So a classical example is Newtonian to Einsteinian physics. Now, under the Newtonian model, which worked well for about 200 years, so if you were to use the argument that, look, it works, so therefore it's true, Newtonian mechanics, right? Newtonian mechanics worked well for 200 years. Yet Einstein came along in the beginning of the 20th century, and he completely flipped the scientific community on its head. He showed, according to his model, that gravity was no longer a pulling force, it was a pushing force due to space-time curvature. The definition of mass itself changed. The very definition that we were using to make predictions, going back, if you remember these slides, you were making predictions in 6 months' time, where is this planet going to be? Einstein came along and said, well, the definition of mass that you're using here is actually incorrect. And also, according to the Newtonian model, time and space are fixed. And Einstein came along and showed actually they're like fabric, they're like dynamic, they are flexible, they're not actually rigid. So the two models are totally different. There's a complete paradigm shift. Yet, Newtonian mechanics worked well for 200 years. Theories work even when they are flat out wrong. So, for example, in chemistry we have the phlogiston theory. Phlogiston theory turned out to be false because there's no such thing as phlogiston, but using that theory we discovered nitrogen. Nitrogen is an element and it is real and it is something that we use in cars, for example. Likewise, we can still go to the moon based upon Newtonian mechanics, but the model, the Newtonian model, has now been superseded by the Einsteinian model. Theories work even when they contradict each other. So, here in this university, you're going to have a physics department. In the physics department, you can go speak to the professors and say, Professor so-and-so, do you believe in Einstein's theory of general relativity? You'd say, of course. Do you believe in quantum mechanics? You'd say, of course. But both of these cannot be true, literally, because the fundamental assumptions contradict each other. So, scientific theories are accepted to be true, not true, they work, even when they're contradicting each other. So, even today in physics, we have this, two different theories which are accepted to be correct, yet they both can't be true. Any introductory book on the philosophy of science is going to give you this. It's going to give you an understanding that the philosophy of science teaches us that scientific theories can change. Ignore the handsome looking guy, I know he's fit now, but what this particular book says, Philosophy of Science, a very short introduction to Oxford University, is this. Historically, there are many cases of theories that we now believe to be false, but that were empirically quite successful. Now, this author, this picture is not of the guy who wrote the book. This is Larry Loden, who is a philosopher at the University of Texas, and he's compiled a philosophical paper where he puts together amazingly sophisticated and empirically verified, predictably powerful scientific theories which turned out to be completely false. So this is well known and understood in academia. Hang on a second. This goes back to the same point I was making in the beginning. There is a big difference between the public understanding and the academic understanding. The public understanding is science gives you facts. Science gives you truth. Science gives you everything. If you want to say someone's being irrational, nowadays we sometimes say they're being unscientific. Because this idea that science is the only root of knowledge, science is the only way of looking at the world. Right? We're going to cover some of that near the end. Another book, again by Oxford University, but a bit more advanced, The Philosophy of Science, a New Introduction, it says this. Science is revisable. Hence, to talk of scientific proof is dangerous. Because the term fosters the idea of conclusions that are graven in stone. How many times have you heard the word scientific proof? Raise your hand if you've heard that. Isn't it surprising that in academia they're actually saying, do not say that word. It's dangerous. Yet, what's interesting is, if you look at it from a young age, we've actually been socialized into accepting that science gives you facts. I have two young daughters, they will sometimes watch this, not sometimes, when their mom's away, I always play Peter Rabbit, right? Peter Rabbit is my way of keeping them busy while I can check on Facebook. On Peter Rabbit, and I'm really shocked, it's a children's program, so literally toddlers. On there, the rabbits are talking amongst each other, and one of them says, scientific proof. And I'm not kidding, if you actually go along and you actually retrace your from the time that you first gained consciousness to now, and we were to look at every stage of your life, you've been socialized into this way of thinking as well, that science gives you facts, science gives you truth. Okay, let's look at some things. So we have the idea that science is not something which gives you certainty. But when we look at popular TV programs. They are promoting this idea of scientism, that science is the only root of knowledge, and science gives you facts, and science gives you certainty. For example, anyone here, I'm going to admit, a few days ago I was watching The Simpsons on YouTube, right? I'm sure some of you have heard of this program, Simpsons, right? What happens to Homer Simpson when he finally gets that crayon that comes out of his nose and he becomes super intelligent? Anyone seen that? Okay, am I really dating here? Huh? You've seen that episode? Well done. That and your haircut, I'm giving you a repeater badge. So, what happens to Homer when he gets that crayon out of his nose? He becomes intelligent. What does he do when he becomes intelligent? He becomes an atheist. Yeah? Google it. Put in Homer Simpson's in YouTube, and when he actually becomes intelligent. It's the only episode in the whole series where that dumb guy becomes intelligent. What's the first thing when he becomes intelligent? He not only becomes an atheist, then he talks to that Christian neighbor of his. What's his name? Flanders. So Flanders, right? Flanders, and what does he do? He tries to convince him God doesn't exist. Okay. The other day, I was at my cousin's house, and they're like teenagers and stuff. And in between playing Fortnite, they sometimes watch TV. And they were watching this program, Young Sheldon. Anyone heard of that? Oh my God, the amount of atheism in that program. He's challenging his teachers, he's saying God doesn't exist, he's saying religions are man-made, he's like the intelligent kid in Texas. And then obviously you have the Big Bang Theory, which is where the show came from, again, that promotes atheism. Okay. What else? X-Men. In X-Men, when they're having this conference of these secret world leaders, and one of them comes forward, right? One of them comes forward and says, Homo erectus, and then he brings out this study from Oxford University in the program, and he says, when Homo erectus when Homo sapiens came, they came and they totally replaced Homo erectus, right? And likewise, the mutants which are going to come in the future, they are going to replace the Homo sapiens. So he was bringing in an evolutionary aspect. Now what's interesting is this, mutants. Where do mutants come from? I mean, how do normal people become mutants in X-Men? Huh? Because of a mutated gene. Right. Anybody that has the smallest whiff of understanding of the criticism of Darwin's theory, they would know what is the whole problem to do with mutations. Sorry? They're random, and they are, because they're random, what is the main problem? They're not beneficial. Yeah? They're not beneficial. They're actually harmful. Now you've got this program which is about the evolution of human beings, and the mutations are positively beneficial. This isn't like a conspiracy theory. Yeah? There is a lot of social engineering that's actually happening in that really crap film which should never have been made, Batman vs Superman. Sorry? What's that spot? So, one of the main criticisms of Darwin's theory is that mutations are random, and because they're random, they're harmful, so you can't get like the complexity that we are now compared to what we were before. Mutations break down an organism, they don't build up an organism. So the main sort of racket against Darwin's theory is mutations are harmful. Yeah, we're going to cover that later. Yeah, mutations are harmful. Mutations are harmful. Now you've got the program X-Men, which is all about beneficial mutations. Now, Batman vs Superman. In the program, which is a mega hit film, translated into many languages, people from all across the world watching it. In that program, they actually bring in Neil deGrasse Tyson. Anyone know who that is? Who's Neil deGrasse Tyson? More than that.
Oh, he's an astrophysicist.
He's an astrophysicist and a
Director of the Hubble
He's a militant advocate of getting rid of religion and agnosticism and atheism, this nonsense. They bring him in a section of the film for a few seconds and he's talking about evolution. What the hell does Batman and Superman have to do with evolution? So these things are not, they're not coincidental. That from a young age, from the time that you're watching Peter Rabbit, or when you were young watching what's that, Tweenies or whatever those studio programs were, yeah? From that till now, and now you're going to start noticing this when you're watching TV or when you're actually doing things. You're going to start noticing this type of social engineering. However, from an academic point of view, this is not right. Okay. Anyone here heard of Richard Dawkins? One, two, okay. What's really interesting about Richard Dawkins is if you look at his public narrative is Darwin's theory is true, the people who don't believe in it are friggin' insane, and so on and so on and so on and so on. Yet, in one of his lesser known works, this is what he says. And an invisible blue Peter badge for anybody who gets the answer right once I ask it. This is what he says in his book. We must acknowledge the possibility that new facts may come to light which will force our successors of the 21st century to abandon Darwinism or modify it beyond recognition. What problem is he referring to here?
Evolution.
Sorry?
Evolution?
No, evolution's Darwinism, and we're going to cover the difference between evolution and Darwinism, two different things.
The idea that other ideas might come which might explain our existence better than what previous theories have done so.
Close. Which part of the philosophy of science that we covered is he talking about right now?
Alternative explanation for the same data.
Sorry, say that again?
Alternative explanation for the same data. The scattered.
It's actually the other one. Which is?
Novel observations.
Novel observations, is right about that. Invisible blue Peter badge for you, right? So, he's saying new facts may come to light which will force our success of the 21st century to abandon Darwinism and modify beyond recognition. He's referring to the problem of induction, right? Because nothing is beyond that problem. That problem is a very real issue in science. Some people think that is a limitation of science, but I think we should actually call it the beauty of science, because that's why scientific conclusions can actually change. They don't just remain rigid forever. Okay. We're about halfway through or something, right? So, before I move on to the next section, is there any questions? Yes, sir.
Just about mutations and stuff. What about adaptation and natural selection?
Yeah.
So isn't that like in essence when mutations could lead to something good? Or for example, when you have bacteria and they develop antibiotic resistance.
Yeah.
So that's happening because of mutations.
Yeah.
So they're not necessarily harmful.
Yeah. So that's a good question. Now, the first thing to understand is that when it comes to natural selection, and natural selection coupled with mutations, random mutations, there's two ways of understanding it. When it comes to, say, bacteria, and you have bacteria and you apply some medicine to it, and some of them have some mutations that they survive and the rest don't. That particular, those particular studies that have actually been done, those bacteria that have those abilities to actually survive, that observation is not enough to explain the tree of life or how natural selection coupled with random mutation can explain biodiversity. That is a limited set of information which has been extrapolated beyond what its explanatory power is. So, as an example, say there's somebody who is an expert in terms of arrows, right? Now they shoot up an arrow towards the sky. And what they do is that we study the distance from where they shot the arrow to about 10 meters above it. And they shoot it really, really far, so it goes very, very far, right? Not even 10 meters, say 3 meters. And we say, okay, in 3 meters, this arrow, not 3 meters. In 1 second, this arrow has traveled 3 meters in terms of that. That's fine. Now somebody can then make a prediction. Therefore, in the next second, it's going to travel another 3 meters. Fair enough. Therefore, in the next second, it's going to travel another 3 meters. Okay, now you're pushing it. Therefore, after an hour, it's going to get to space. Now you're going to start thinking, hang on a second. You can't use how far it went in that small increment of time and extrapolate it to everything. This is what's happening with natural selection. So, as an example of natural selection in this room, say that a fire breaks out in this room and all of us have to run towards that door, and the last person who happens to be here is going to basically die. Let's just make up that scenario because of smoke or whatever, right? So the fire alarm goes off, we all run. The person who is the least fittest in terms of their cognitive abilities to understand there's a fire alarm going off, or their abilities to run, they're least likely to survive. That is natural selection, right? So you have, in a population, those people who are the least fit, they don't survive for the next generation. However, that piece of data, that form of natural selection, this was known before Darwin. But what Darwin did is he didn't speak about natural selection as a small thing to bacteria or to human beings. He said, this explains all of life. And the problem with that is, this is an undue extrapolation. It's like the arrow example. You're taking an example which may make sense within a small set of data, but then you're extrapolating it to all of life. What we have seen in terms of animals, you can breed ants. Right? You can breed them. You can take a big ant and breed it with another big ant. You can keep breeding them. Can you? And you can do this with dogs as well. You know, you have artificial selection. People do this with pigeons. You know, you can get different classes of birds and start saying, okay, I want to get a pit bull. So you get different types of dogs. You start getting them to mate, and over time you get something like a chihuahua or pit bull or whatever. But if you were to do that with ants, say, and you're to keep breeding them, would you get ants the size of elephants? No, because there's a limit to the body plan and what is achievable. And the whole problem with Darwin's theory is that it takes an extrapolation, which in its small explanatory scope makes sense for that, but then it applies it to the whole of life, like 4 billion years and like a trillion. It's estimated there's a trillion species. That's an undue extrapolation. So that's the problem. That there's 2 different meanings of natural selection. Now, I sort of jumped the gun because we were going to do that later, but that's why this format of doing it is a lot better. Because if you had that question and you'd be thinking about it and really, concentrate on stuff. Okay. Any other questions before we move on? Does that make sense? Okay, so say you have somebody who's giving a lecture about Darwin's theory of evolution, and they basically go off on one. They're like, whether you look at biochemistry, or you look at genetics, or you look at anatomy, or you look at morphology, or you look at biogeography, or bioinformatics, or psychology, or linguistics, every one of these subfields goes back to show Darwin was right. There's one thing that you can do to challenge anybody who comes up with that sort of record. And that thing is, if Darwin's theory is a scientific theory, then like all scientific theories, it can't be absolutely true. It can't be absolutely true, because you can always have a future prediction which challenges your previous theory, and the same data can give rise to alternative theories. However, on top of that, you can say three things, apart from the philosophy of science. The philosophy of science is enough, but apart from that, you can say three things. No biologist in the world and no philosopher of science in the world can deny these three things that I'm about to say. From a public perspective, Darwin's theory is as true as the existence of this table. However, from an academic point of view, Darwin's theory is based on a probabilistic framework. It has assumptions that it's based upon, and there are core disputes amongst some biologists about its main ideas. No biologist and no philosopher of biology, no academic of any sort that's worth his salt, would deny PAD. Probabilistic framework, assumptions, disputes. No one can deny that. Is that strange to hear?
No.
I guess no. It is actually strange to hear from the majority of people, because all their life they've been hearing this theory is true, this theory is true, this theory is absolute. You have to be backwards not to believe it. So it is a shock for most people except for the people in Birmingham in this room. So evolution and Darwinism, these are two different things. So again, there's a big difference between the public understanding and the academic understanding. A big difference between the public understanding and the academic understanding. Evolution simply means biological change over time. Evolution simply means biological change over time. Okay, here's an interesting fact. Evolution was written about, theorized about, philosophized about for at least approximately 3,000 years. Again, another piece of information which shows you the difference between the public understanding and the academic understanding. Because the public understanding is Darwin came up with the idea of evolution. Yay or nay? Yay? Good. The academic understanding is evolution as a concept goes back thousands of years. It goes back before Darwin. Right? So, Darwinian evolution is different to evolution. And the problem is this. This type of evolution, the basic type of evolution, which is bacterial evolution or artificial selection or things that we can observe that were known before Darwin, is very different to Darwinian evolution, also known as Darwinism or Neo-Darwinism. Darwinism says all of life came from one single cell and it evolved via the tree of life. So it gives you a history which is that of a tree. All the organisms in the world go back to a single cell. That's the first point about Darwinism. The second is, how did this happen? How did this tree grow from a single cell to grass, elephants, and Lady Gagas? It's through the process of natural selection. Natural selection is the mechanism by which this happened. So there's two things that Darwin proposed. A history, which is a tree of life, and a mechanism, which is natural selection. Evolution is simply biological change over time. This was known and understood before Darwin. So evolution as a concept, we don't have a problem with as Muslims. What do you have a problem with? Darwinian evolution. But the problem is, these terms are used interchangeably. In fact, you'll hardly ever see the word Darwinism used. You'll always see the word evolution used. What's the problem with that? Again, invisible blue Peter badge for whoever gets this right.
It's like saying one can't be there without the other, essentially.
Sorry?
It's like saying you can't have Darwinism without evolution. In terms of like they.
Yeah, that's actually right. Yeah, that's a problem, but there's a bigger problem.
If you're criticizing, well, if you're saying you're against evolution, then someone will interpret to mean that you're denying all evolution. And not just
Close.
If you're combining them, you're just saying they're the same. So whilst they are fundamentally different, any criticisms would be to both. So if you target a criticism at Darwinian evolution, you'd be targeting it at normal evolution too.
Yeah. So it creates an equivocation. It creates a false equivocation. So, for example, one of the implications of that is, like you said, if you're criticizing the Darwinian concept, someone says you're criticizing evolution. That's one big issue. The second issue is, if somebody is trying to give you evidence for the tree of life, or for natural selection as the mechanism, which is Darwinian evolution, and you ask them for evidence, they'll say bacteria evolves, butterflies evolve, human beings, their skin tone is a product of their geographical environment. So they're giving you the evidence for evolution when you've asked for evidence for Darwinian evolution. And this is a fallacy known as the fallacy of equivocation. Does everyone understand what the problem is here? Yay or nay? Some people are shaking their heads, some people are shaking their legs. I'm not sure what's going on. Do you guys get it? There's a problem, yeah? The problem is that if we don't demarcate what is what, then everything's evolution. You know? So how do we know that human beings and chimpanzees have a common ancestor? Because bacteria evolves. Do you guys see the problem here? Yeah? Fantastic. Okay. Probabilistic framework, right? That's the first term that I introduced. Why is it that it's based on a probabilistic framework? It's simply because if you look at the history of life on Earth, and if you look at the number of scientists that are alive today that are studying biological life forms, and you look at how old the Earth is, and how long life has been on the Earth, and how much data is missing, all this together, and you get a beautiful metaphor. And that beautiful metaphor is taken from the science journal Nature, which is the second most prestigious journal in the world. And the analogy it gives for working out the history of evolution is that of trying to work out the plot of Leo Tolstoy's War and Peace with 13 randomly selected pages. So imagine you have 13 randomly selected pages, which you can see, which have writing on them, and all the rest of the pages are blank. And I was to go give you a copy and you a copy and everybody here a copy with the same 13 pages, maybe page 5, then page 210, you guys get the point. 13 pages, all the rest of the pages are blank. Then I ask you to tell me the plot based upon all the pages which are blank and 13 pages. I ask you, I ask her, and everyone's story is going to be different. Because it's going to be incredibly difficult to work out the history of life on Earth. And that is simply a consequence of a theory that is so broad when it's speaking about the history of life on Earth. It's not a simple example of a scatter graph. It's the example of a scatter graph on steroids. Why? Because 99.999% of organisms have never been observed. That doesn't mean that we've only got a few fossils of the dinosaurs, all the rest of the fossils we don't have. It means we don't have species. There may have been things that were even weirder than dinosaurs. According to the National Science Foundation, 99.999% of species have never been observed. So they're not alive today, we don't have their DNA, and we don't have their fossils. So all of the data that we have for this, the actual organisms that we can study which are alive or fossilized is 0.0001%. And then we are using that to come up with an inference for the 99.999%. Now someone may say, but that figure, problem of induction, can get something in the future which can challenge that figure, the figure can be revised. Yeah, it can. It's true. But the conceptual point is the same, that there is a massive amount of probability involved. And we're not talking about, like, okay, what happened in Birmingham 10,000 years ago, in this spot? Was there a guy chasing a pig with a spear? What's going on? Huh? It's very hard to reconstruct that. 4 billion years ago, there was the first form of life, right? How do we, you have these two factors, 99.999% species, approximately, have never been observed. No fossils, no DNA, they're not alive today. Coupled with 4 billion years ago was the first form of life. How are we to construct a history? Now someone comes along and says, yeah, we worked it out, yeah, it's all good, and it's this and that. What you've got to do is you just got to remind them of these stats. And say, look, are you going to tell me with a straight face that you know exactly what happened 4 billion years ago till now with the data, which is 0.0001%? So you have a question?
I was just going, it's probably a dumb question, but how...
No, no such thing as a dumb question. Unless you ask, am I in the right direction?
How would you know that you're missing all these species if you've never seen them?
Good question. So they use some sort of genetic analysis, and they've come up with some figure like they were before. They used to have this idea that there's millions of species which are missing because for this thing to evolve to this thing, then it has to have this sort of root, and then they changed it from millions to 1 trillion species. Now, all of the science that they used to come up with that figure, I don't know. But from what I recall, one is the figure 99.999%, and the other was that they estimated based on the number of organisms which are alive today, and based on the history of life, or how old life is, they estimated there was 1 trillion species. On Earth today, I think there's something like 6 billion. But they're estimating in total there was 1 trillion from the time of the first form of life till today. Yes?
What are they sure about in terms of the origin of the universe? Most of it's speculative, but what are they definitely certain about?
Origin of the universe or origin of?
The universe, yeah. And how do they work it out? What do they use to work it out?
Okay, cosmology I haven't really studied. But, you know, there's Hamza Sources has written some stuff in it, he studied that. But I don't really know much about cosmology. But what I do know is when we're dealing with, according to them, 4 billion years ago the universe came around, right? The same would apply here. Like, if someone is to come out with, okay, this happened, that happened, well, at best, that's an inference based on a very small fragment of data. Conceptually, these points are independent of science. You can apply, does everyone get this? These points are independent of the science. So it's irrelevant what the science is. These points would stand because they're purely conceptual points. Yes?
You're just talking about all these assumptions are based on the small amount of data that we have.
Yes.
So how much data would it take for you to accept a proposition about a fact or a theory for them to say it's a fact? Like, how much data do you need to have that certainty itself? Like, how much
Okay.
We're all saying this is based on a small amount of data,
Yeah.
but then surely we're never going to have 100% of it.
Yeah. This is why the problem of induction is insoluble. And this is why, from the time of David Hume in the 60s, is, right, and obviously people before him must have realized this problem as well, but it's just a general problem. So there is no answer because any figure you can come up with is purely arbitrary.
So what you're saying is that basically for us to understand the reality of the situation, or the origin of reality as we have it, there is no actual alternative apart from obviously the Muslims, so we believe in what's been sent, etc. So there is saying there is no alternative way or explanation to understand that origin apart from our best guess, if you want to put it that way.
I'll put it in slightly different terms, but I see where you're getting to. So the reality is that different forms of knowledge give you different levels of certainty, or not certainty, but different levels of confidence in things. And I'm going to cover in the end about, how the early Muslims saw science, right? So it's not the case that we don't do science. It's not the case that we just throw out the baby with the bathwater. It's the case that we understand that we will use it as a tool, but we should always understand that that tool is not going to give you certain results. The two extremes are the extreme which we've been brainwashed with, which is that it's true, and the other extreme is, well, it's so useless, let's not do it. When Islam has a very balanced approach, which is that you use it as a tool, and you use it as a way of trying to gain knowledge, but you always keep at the back of your mind that there is always that possibility. And in fact, you don't have to be a Muslim to accept that. I mean, that's a generally understood thing, philosophy of science. That
It's a very depressing notion, isn't it?
not really, because look, you know what's really depressing? What's really depressing is the status quo, right? So I give you I have a magic wand. Don't do the theory, sir. I have a magic wand, and I give you a wife, I give you some children, I give you a house, I give you a car, I give you a job that you go and do, and every year of your life is the same as the year before, and this goes on for hundreds of years. That's friggin' depressing. Yeah? Human beings love change, alright? And this is one of the beauties of Jannah, that Jannah is constantly changing. Groundhog Day, anyone seen that film?
Yeah.
When were you got born? Like 2010 or something? When you got born?
97.
What's that the age of what years were you?
97.
97, oh my god. I feel so old. If you hear someone jumping from the train track, you know who it was today. Meaning I pushed him, not that. Yeah, so basically Groundhog Day, man. The beauty, this is the beauty of science, that you get like if you look at the Newtonian model, yeah? Scientists were like, this is it, this is the holy cow, this is it, we worked out how the universe is working. There's even statements floating around like there's nothing new to discover in physics. Because they had this theory which was explaining everything. Then Einstein came along and just totally changed it. And then you had like Niels Bohr with quantum mechanics, and then a totally different understanding. So the way the deeply held beliefs in the scientific world were challenged, but I mean not only me, but a lot of philosophers and scientists, they actually see a beauty in that. You have that possibility, and that you're not going to be stuck. Imagine you never have to update science books. You have your father will be saying to you, oh, what science book are you using, son? I'm using so and so. Oh, my great-grandfather is using the same book with the same information, the same data. The amazing thing is we always discover new things. We always have these paradigm shifts. So scattergraph on steroids. Okay. Just some stories. So there's a lot of stories which are being pushed out. How did this evolve? How did that evolve? And there's a whole host of these explanations. So one of the stories is about human evolution, how we became bipedal. And so when we came onto the savannah from the trees, when we had chimp-like features, we basically were knuckle walkers. And from the time that we basically stopped doing knuckle walking, we started to walk, we went, hey, what do I do with these things? I might as well cook. And we started cooking, and after we started cooking, we digested more protein, which helps us grow bigger brains. Right? I know it sounds really wacky and crazy, yeah? But that is a scientific explanation of how we got bigger brains. In fact, there's a book called How Cooking Made Us Human. It has like this chick with the chef's hat, right? You get a lot of these stories, you get a lot of these things, you know, this happened, that happened. But again, the difference between the public and the academic understanding, Richard Lewontin, who is an atheist evolutionary biologist, he's a professor at Harvard University, he calls these type of things just so stories. He says these are just so stories. What are just so stories, by the way? Anyone know what just so stories are? Yes?
They're like fairy tales kind of
Yeah.
how things happen. So like, how did the elephant get a long trunk? Or
Yeah.
how did the butterfly get wings or
Yeah.
stuff like that? Is that fairy tales?
Yeah. And these are based on Rudyard Kipling's book. So exactly like you said, sister, how did the elephant get its long trunk? There's a crocodile that was trying to drag it into the water and it got longer and longer and longer and longer. Evolutionary biologists, eminent evolutionary biologists who aren't religious believers, who are outright atheists, they are saying about these stories that we've been fed, these are just so stories. They're not empirically grounded. By the way, these type of views, are these mainstream or are they fringe? What did I say about them? No. These views about the disputes, not being probabilistic framework with assumptions with disputes. I'm talking about the biologists that challenge Darwin's theory. It's actually a fringe. But it goes to show you that it can be challenged. Yeah? That it's not that you have to challenge it because you're a religious believer. You do have people who don't believe in God, but they do put up scientific arguments against it. We also get this very simple notion, hey, look at that looks simple. I mean, that looks similar to that, so that must have a common ancestor, right? So there's this part of the elbow, this part of the elbow of the chin, humans and chimps must have a common ancestor. Whether you look at genetic data, biochemical data, or morphology, you have these simple notions. Two things look similar, therefore they have a common ancestor. Two problems with this. Number one is circular reasoning. If you say similarities are due to common descent, similarities exist, therefore similarities are due to common descent. If you're going to leave it as an assumption, that's fine. So that's the first problem. The second problem is, we know of similarities that are not due to common descent. So we have, for example, the wing of a bat and the wing of a bird. These are not due to common ancestry. These are homoplasy, not homology. Homology, they assume similarities are due to common descent. We have genes for echolocation in dolphins and genes for echolocation in bats, and these are again not due to common ancestry. And these very simplistic notions that this is similar to this, therefore we have a common ancestor, these are actually challenged. Now I want you to consider something. This is a quote written by an atheist evolutionary academic, a philosopher of biology, an eminent philosopher of biology. His name is Elliot Sober. In his book, Evidence and Evolution, which is published by Cambridge University, this is what he says. And just think about how different these words are from the words that we've been told when we were young, or even now. Both of the following thoughts are naive. Humans and chimps must share a common ancestor because they're so similar, and humans and mushrooms must have arisen independently because they are so different. Within a probabilistic framework, there is no must in either case. How different is that to... It's a fact that humans and chimpanzees have a common ancestor. It's a fact that the tree of life is true. It's a fact. You can clearly see there is a big difference between the two. Even, for example, the tree of life, right? The tree of life as a concept is taught as if it's as true as this table, or the shape of the earth. However, just in 2016, 3 years ago, at the Royal Society, which is the oldest and most prestigious scientific society in the world, a group of biologists came together and they came to discuss Darwin's central thesis in The Origin of Species and whether he was right. So 150 years after his publication, or after the publication of The Origin of Species, 150 years from every level, from elementary to university level, and in documentaries and in the popular media, we've been told the tree of life is a fact. Sorry, we've been told natural selection being the main thesis of Darwin is a fact. The Royal Society just 3 years ago had come together to discuss, does it even work? And of course you have the majority who said it does, and you had the sizable minority of secular evolutionary biologists saying, no it doesn't, we need an alternative. I'm not picking sides saying they're right or they're wrong. All I'm saying is, look at the propaganda. Look at the propaganda between the public understanding and the academic understanding.
So just a question. You know, with inference and induction, are you saying they're one and the same? Like, what is the difference between inference and induction? As in, are they one and the same, or are they both different concepts?
Okay, so good question. So
the reason I asked that actually, just so you understand where I'm coming from, sorry. Because in the Quran, for example, we're constantly told, like, you know, there's different arguments put forward. The sun rises, like, you know, like the arguments that I think Musa took to Fir'aun. Like, but I think it was Fir'aun, was it? I can't remember. But basically, like, you know, my God is the one who.
You know about Ibrahim and Islam with his nations?
Yeah, basically, you know the different arguments that are put forth.
Right.
And then basically all these arguments, the essential endpoint is that you infer or induct that there is a God, that there is a one Lord.
Yeah.
So I'm saying that if we're basically encouraged to use that same reasoning and logic that, for example, the prophets used, so I don't understand what's the issue in inferring and inducting.
Okay, good. So firstly, there's two different things here, right? So when it comes to inference and induction, induction is you make a generalization based upon the limited set of data that you have. Induction involves inference. Inference doesn't necessarily have like a generalization to it. When it comes to, say, Ibrahim alayhi salam talking to his nation, right? He is not using data to infer the existence of God. This is a common misunderstanding. None of the prophets and none of the Islamic scholars have said that reasoning is there to infer God's existence. The argument is different. The argument is that human beings have an innate belief in God which is intrinsic to themselves, and that is called the fitrah in Islam. And inference, in terms of rational arguments which I use, which are different to science, by the way, because reason is different to science. Science is a subset. Yeah? Those are used to remind people of what they already know. So in the Quran, if you look at the arguments which are used by the prophets, the arguments are not used to prove that Allah is the Rabb. The arguments are used to prove that Allah is the only one worthy of worship. There's a difference between these two. So, we believe, and this I was going to cover at the end.
You can cover it at the end if you want.
No, it's fine, but since you asked it now, this is one of those topics that is a really good segue to understand Islamic epistemology. Yeah? Because for us, our starting point is the fitrah. And we use science, we use inference, we use induction, we use other tools, but fundamentally, we don't believe that by using your limited mind, you can arrive at something with certainty. Right? The inference, which is used in, say, deductive logic, that can give you a level of certainty. Yeah? But the inference which is used in, say, inductive, because there's a difference between inductive and deductive, yeah? That won't give you that level of certainty. And when it comes to us understanding about, say, arguments of prophethood of the Prophet, someone says, well, can't you apply the problem of induction? There's a difference. Because if you look at induction, what does induction say? Induction says that you're making a prediction about the future. Yeah? And you have a generalization today which can be challenged any time in the future. When it comes to, say, the prophecies of the Prophet, those prophecies, there's no future observation which can challenge a confirmed prophecy. So as an example, the Prophet said, near the end of time, that you will see he spoke about the Bedouin Arabs, not the city-dwelling Arabs, the Bedouin Arabs. They will compete with each other with tall buildings. Now, throughout the times, Islamic scholars, before this prophecy came true in our time, they actually wrote about this. Imam Nawawi and others, they wrote about this. They said, this basically means that these Bedouin Arabs, not the city-dwelling Arabs that live in Makkah and Damascus and Cairo, they will become the leaders of people. They will live in palaces. They will become rich. They will build buildings out of extravagance. They will do this, they will do that. And that was confirmed in this century. That the same people, as a friend of mine said, they went from camels to Cadillacs. They just did this huge generational jump. There's nothing in the future which can deny, in future observation that can deny what we just saw as a confirmed thing. So I can see, and your question is very clever, and we've had this question in the past, is how does this impact the Islamic certainty, why we believe? It doesn't if we understand it correctly. That's the short answer. But the longer answer is a lot longer. I think we can go on for a bit. Is that sufficient for now?
Yeah, for now.
Perfect. Okay, assumptions. So, again, I said this is not a philosophy class, it's not a biology class, it's a class to unbrainwash, to show the difference between the public understanding and the academic understanding. Public understanding is, it's a true theory. It's fact. Academically, probabilistic framework with assumptions, with disputes. There's a whole host of assumptions. Natural selection being the driving force, genes being transmitted vertically, the gene-centered view, gradualism, tree of life should be there, that's a mistake. That's what the assumption is about. So that should really be homology. Acquired characteristics is not inherited, mutations are random. You may say, what the hell does this mean? It doesn't matter. All that matters is you need to know assumptions are involved. It's not something which anybody can deny. There's also alternatives to Darwin's theory. There's evolution by natural genetic engineering, there is neo-Lamarckian evolution, and there's mutation-driven evolution. The third way of evolution is a project run by secular mainstream biologists, and these are people from Oxford, Harvard, MIT, Princeton, China, Europe, everywhere you can imagine. And these people are coming together and saying, we don't believe in Darwinism, but we don't believe in intelligent design of God either. We're trying to come up with a third way. And what's interesting is that they don't believe they have those academic freedoms to be able to express themselves, some of them, which is why they have this the third way of evolution. Now what's interesting is that, and this again is a very deep topic, but because this is an introductory, because this particular course about Islam and evolution, you can have it as a 3-day thing, you can have it as a whole day thing, so this is just very, very basic introduction. Long story short, naturalism is the idea that everything can be explained naturally, and that is one of the assumptions of science, that everything can be explained naturally. So because of that assumption, which is known as methodological naturalism, there's no such thing as design, there's no such thing as independent ancestry, human beings have to be linked to something else, and lastly, we have a naturalistic purpose. There's some quotes in regards to that. And this is, I believe, thank God, maybe in. Okay, what did I say at the beginning? There's a difference between the public understanding and the academic understanding. And I said, this is going to be a theme of the talk. Public understanding, academic understanding. Public understanding, academic understanding. Big difference between the two. And the point I was going to get to, getting to now, is why. Why is there such a gap between the public understanding and the academic understanding? And the reason is that Darwin's theory is not just a scientific theory. Darwin's theory is not just science. I'm not denying it's science, it is a valid scientific theory. theory. It's not true literally. But it's not just science. This is very important to understand. Darwin's theory is a metaphysical belief system. It is something apart from science. Now, you may say, well, that's easy for you to do. You know, you're a Muslim, you don't believe in Darwin's theory, so you're just going to label Darwinian evolution or Darwinism as religion, just to try and degrade it. However, consider something. That handsome bloke who looks like Garfield at the bottom of the slide, that is Professor Michael Roos. And he is an expert when it comes to Darwin's theory of evolution. In fact, he is considered one of the leading authorities in the world in regards to his theory. His books are published by mainstream universities like Oxford and Cambridge. He is invited all over the world, and he is an outright card-carrying atheist. So he doesn't have any truck with religious people. He recently published a book, and the title of the book is the title of this slide, Darwinism as Religion, published by Oxford University. You can buy that book. In that book, he says Darwin's theory is two things. One is science. No one denies that it's a science. Two is that it's also a religion. It's also an alternative to conventional religions. And it's been like that from the very beginning. Now, the second handsome bloke there in black and white is Julian Huxley. Julian Huxley is, again, another Darwinian academic. He was an evolutionary biologist who was very prominent in the 20th century. He is the grandson, as you can imagine, of T.H. Huxley, who was known as Darwin's bulldog. So Julian Huxley was a militant atheist, an evolutionary biologist, and a philosopher. So it's kind of like Shaitan and Fir'aun having the worst of all possible worlds. Now, and you can see some really evil eyebrows as well. So this guy, he wrote a book in 1927. And that book in 1927 was called Religion Without Revelation. Religion Without Revelation. Does that make any sense? The title, Religion Without Revelation. Basically what he says is there is a religion which has come around, and this is a religion which is not sent by God, but it is a religion. And this is a religion which, according to him, we must propagate to the world. And this religion is atheistic, and this religion is going to make the world progressive and enlightened and take us to a new height. And this new religion he called evolutionary humanism. Evolutionary humanism. And, just before I get to your question, he wasn't just some biologist working in his mom's basement. He was one of the most prominent biologists of the 20th century, and he was the first president of UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. He was the founding president of that, and UNESCO has a direct influence on the educational systems across the world of the UN member nations. This isn't a conspiracy theory. These are facts which anybody can verify. This is a very dangerous idea which someone with a lot of power used throughout the 20th century, and a lot of us today, whether we've heard of this handsome gentleman or not, have been directly impacted by the work that he's been working on.
So, what year was that?
His book was 1927. Him becoming the founding president, I don't know. But Religion Without Revelation, 1927 is when he first published it. You can still get that book as a new publication.
Well, like this scientist from Jewish background originally. There are a lot of the Jews they migrated and they became secular afterwards, like Freud and people like that.
That's not really linked to this. I don't really know much about that. So clearly, it's something more than science. Whether you're a proponent of Darwinian evolution or you're an opponent of Darwinian evolution, that's the case. And why? Because there is something about the theory which gives atheism, what atheists believe, is it gives them justification. Richard Dawkins, in his book, The Blind Watchmaker, which was published in the 1980s, he said, Darwin allowed us to be intellectually satisfied atheists. It is a material Genesis story. It is their version of biblical creation. A materialistic Genesis story upon which they build their worldview. What's interesting is that although Richard Dawkins says, and atheists today say, that Darwin's theory led them to atheism, or Darwin's theory is atheistic, or Darwin's theory made them intellectually satisfied atheists, Darwin himself was never an atheist. Darwin himself said, in my wildest fluctuations, I was never an atheist. Darwin said, I never intended to write atheistically. And in fact, he said, it is absurd to think that somebody cannot believe in my theory. It's absurd to think somebody can be an evolutionist and not believe in God. And believe in God. He's saying, you can believe in God and this theory. It's absurd to think you can't be a theist and an evolutionist. In fact, and this is really interesting, Darwin published The Origin of Species in what year? Come on guys, university students here. I'm going to assume you're too humble to give the answer. So, 1859. 1859, Darwin published The Origin of Species. When he published The Origin of Species, he got feedback from the public. One academic who believed in God wrote in his review of Darwin's book, he wrote, whether God created all of life through one cell, like Darwin says, or God created all species independently, like the Christians believe, either way, both of these things are just as noble for God. Do you understand what this academic is saying in review of Darwin's book? He's not saying I believe in Darwin. He's not saying I don't believe in Darwin. He's saying who cares? Whether God created one form of life which evolved into everything else, or God created all these forms of life independently, or they have different origins, both of these are just as noble. What was Darwin's reaction? This is really interesting stuff. What was Darwin's reaction? He took that review of his book and he stuck it in the second edition of The Origin of Species. That shows you how anti-God he was. Lastly, Islam and Darwinism. Islam is a religion. Darwinism is a religion. These are two different alternative systems. These are two metaphysical commitments. It's not just the case of there's a science and there's a religion. As a Muslim, we can say we believe in Darwin's theory as a valid scientific theory, but we don't accept it to be literally true. The same we can apply to string theory or any other theory in science. So we're not denying that it's a valid theory. However, the religion of Darwinism, which comes across as it is true literally, and that it comes across as a literal alternative to Islam, then we would say, no, we as Muslims cannot accept that. That is where the contradiction is. So in this presentation I've covered the relationship between science and certainty, the state of Darwinism, and why Darwinian evolution is unlike any scientific theory in the history of science. It is more than just a scientific theory, it is also a worldview, it is also a metaphysical research program, it is undoubtedly a religion. Everything good I've said is from Allah, every mistake is my own. Jazakallah khair for listening. And if you have any questions, then we will entertain them now.
No one has any questions. There's this idea that it's more geological, that, who's a Scottish scientist, like, as the Earth sort of is created in 7 days, I think it says, 7 days or 6 days? 6 days, sorry. But science obviously, on the contrary, doesn't agree with that. And this Scottish science philosopher actually said that time is created after the Earth was created in some ways. So like everything that's been created is outside of time. So,
okay. So before I answer your question, I'm going to give you a methodology, right? And the methodology is this. As Muslims, we have our own worldview and we have our own epistemology, our own theory of knowledge. One of the reasons why Islam had a lot of issues in the early centuries after the first 3 generations of Muslims, and actually even during the third of those generations, is that Muslims started adopting Greek and Hellenistic thinking and trying to understand Islam using those things. So as a principle, what I would say is that, say there's a Christian philosopher or there's a Christian theologian, and he says, how we reconcile the 6 days of creation is through like this or like that. The first thing I would say is that never go to those sources. Always go back and see what do Muslim thinkers, what have they said about this. Go to the classical understanding of the Quran and the classical tafsir and what it says about these things. This is just a general method because there is no understanding of Islam which is better than the understanding of the early Muslims. That's just a given. So someone can come along today and say, based upon my reading of the Quran and my reading of the narrations of the Prophet ﷺ, this is what I derive, right? And if that conflicts the consensus of what people came up with before, then we would say you can't do that, right? If, say, for example, we had space exploration, and I believe the Indonesian Fatwa Council, they gave a fatwa about how to pray in space, yeah? That obviously is not challenging that. But if someone was to come along and say, oh, the Quran is open to interpretation, that there's more prophets after the Prophet ﷺ, will say, no way, Jose, because that goes against what the consensus was. So, before we look at what anybody says, let's look at what the Quranic commentators say. The first thing, which is really interesting, is that according to the Quran, time is relative. And the idea of time being relative is not a liberal interpretation. This was known from before because of the explicit verses in the Quran, which Allah mentions a day with your Lord is like 1,000 years, and other times Allah mentions time. That's the first point. The second is when Allah says ayyam, it doesn't mean literal days. This is always understood. It meant periods of time. So, 6 days, when you read, say, Yusuf Ali's translation of the Quran, or the Hadith or whatever, it just says 6 days, and we think 6 days in English, and it's 24 hours. No, that's not the understanding. The understanding is, it's a period of time. How long is that period of time? Allah knows. Right? Likewise, when it mentions the difference between the first heaven and the second heaven, they say a travel of 500 years. 500 years according to what speed? Right? Because a distance of 500 years, if you're going with a camel, it's very different to if you're going on a rocket, it's very different to if you're going in something else. Right? So that's just a principle. And a lot of issues that come up, whether it's issues to do with evolution, issues to do with qadr, issues to do with the earth being created in a certain period of time, the root cause of these issues, I believe, and this is not just my belief, it's the belief which many du'at have told me and we discuss amongst ourselves, is that people don't know and understand the basics of Islam. They don't know their own tradition. They don't know their own, like, I'm not kidding. When I give talks across the country, when you sometimes meet Muslims and they may ask you about some random thing, you know, what do you think about this sheikh, you refute this guy, and you ask them a basic thing about Islam and they don't know. A very basic thing, they don't know. Right? So we need to just get those foundations right, because if your building is based upon creaky foundations, you can't build upon that building and you can't sleep comfortably because you might think it's going to collapse. So you have to go to the very roots of your foundations and understand, okay, why do we even believe Islam is true? Why do we even see Islam in this light? Why do we accept this particular interpretation? And this is why, as students, and you have more free time now than when you're going to leave university, this is the time to build your knowledge of Islam. And in, mashallah, places like Birmingham, there's a lot of places where you can, gain knowledge and stuff like that. And even the internet and, these sort of things is very different to, I not too long ago I went to Poland, and there's like a few Muslims in a city which the majority of people are hostile to Islam, and people get attacked for wearing the hijab and, having beards and stuff. So we are in a very comfortable environment, and we should be taking advantage of that. That's just a general reminder for everyone. Okay. Yes?
Yeah, even, I think you briefly mentioned Darwin's theory and eugenics and colonialism, and also that UNESCO on his body. So what, I just want to expand a bit more upon that.
Okay. So basically, what you have to understand is that when a theory is no longer a theory, it is something apart from a theory, it has implications. If I believe that after I die, there is no reckoning, that's going to impact the way I view the world. Contrary to the nonsense which comes out, which is, oh yeah, you can be a good person without believing in God. Okay, yeah, that's a fairy tale, yeah? The reality is, if you don't believe that there is anything after death, there's no accountability, then your actions are going to be different to somebody who believes they're going to be accountable. Does everyone get that point? The beliefs that you hold have an implication. Okay, Darwin believed in his theory to be true, although there are parts in his book, like chapter 6, which is all about the doubts in his theory, but by and large, he had a level of confidence in his theory. That theory basically says that you have organisms that have, some are more fitter than others, and then they're more likely to survive. So according to Darwin, not only do organisms compete, not only do deers and lions compete, human beings compete, and different types of human beings compete. So for Darwin, the highest level of human beings were Caucasians, and of the highest level of Caucasians was the Victorian English, as you don't know, that he also happened to be. This is why he explained that there was a big difference between the white colonial races which conquered North America, which were Anglo-Saxon, like America, and the Spanish, and how they were more successful, although the Spanish are still white, and the French, of course, are also white, but how the Anglo-Saxon, English, if you like, races were way more successful than the other. Now, that's just a little preview of what he has about other races, if that's what he believed about others. So let's go to another race, the Turks. Darwin, when he was, because remember, if you believe a theory to be true, like if I believe I'm possessed by a jinn or a jinni, right? I'm convinced there's like something, right? I look back and say, I think this thing's moved, or I think it was a jinn did it. Anything is evidence for you. Or if someone believes they're being chased by the CIA or whatever, right? So Darwin saw evidence for his theory everywhere. Evidence which did not exist. But in his head it did, and in the heads of other people it did. So one of the things is, when he saw, during his time, the Ottomans were a empire in Europe. They were fighting against the Europeans, and they lost in a battle. So when Darwin gave his political commentary on that battle that took place in his lifetime between the Ottoman Turks and the Europeans, he said the savage Turks were beaten hollow by the superior Caucasians. So he saw that as another confirmation. Look, the savage Turks were beaten by the Europeans. When he looked at black people, again, as you can guess, the black people were right at the bottom. So you have the black, which were closer to chimpanzees, then you go up, then you get like Chinese or whatever, then you go up and get like whatever tinted colored, then you get like white, and then you get like the Victorian English, right? So that was his hierarchy. He said that some black people in Africa, they have feet with opposable thumbs. You know, like human beings, like our hands, right? Imagine these hands were actually your feet. So you have opposable thumbs like this on your feet. You're black. Do you have them? You don't. No. Okay. Imagine if a Muslim scientist said something like that. The whole social media would be crazy about how backwards these Muslims are. Stupid Muslims believe black people have feet like this. Darwin says that in The Descent of Man. Not all black people, he says some black people. And he also says that's why they're good at climbing trees. I'm not making this up. The Descent of Man. Get it from Amazon. Read it. And if you want to go around checking the view of black people, do it, yeah? To disconfirm his theory. He believed these things. He also said in the near future, a couple of 100 years, he said the civilized races, which is Caucasian, is going to exterminate these savage races, which is black, Asian, right? He made that very clear description in The Descent of Man. On top of that, when he went to South America, he came to meet the Fuegians, who were an indigenous people. He described the Fuegians as brutes, people who could hardly speak, that used to grunt, that used to be savage-like, that hardly had any civilization. What's interesting is, if you look at his writings about the Fuegians, it fits in line with his theory. They're savage, they're backward, they're whatever. When you actually look at the Fuegians, when you look at what actual Fuegians, they were just the people who lived in South America. When people who visited the Fuegians decades before Darwin, they were chroniclers, they wrote, these are a sophisticated people with a vocab of about 30,000 words. They have a hierarchy of system. They take care of their elderly. They have a completely different description to Darwin. But Darwin saw something else. In fact, and this is the last point I want to end upon, we call it Darwin's theory, but it was not known as Darwin's theory in Victorian times. In Victorian times, Darwin's theory was known as what? Who's going to get the last three invisible limited badge? Darwin's theory in Victorian times is known as what?
Atheistic theory?
No. Darwin's theory in Victorian times, when Darwin was alive, was never referred to as Darwin's theory of evolution. It was referred to as Darwin and Wallace's theory. Darwin and Wallace. Even now, if you were to go to a bookshop and go get an old book, or even from Amazon get a reprint of Victorian books, or even books at the beginning of the 20th century, Darwin and Wallace, Wallace and Gromit, except it's Darwin and Wallace. Darwin and Wallace. Who the hell is Wallace?
Scottish.
No. Wallace was Darwin's co-author with the theory. His name was Alfred Russel Wallace. Like Darwin, he didn't have a religion. He didn't have, he wasn't Christian or Muslim or anything. He believed in the tree of life, he believed in this. Wallace, together with Darwin, they published the theory, and it was known as Darwin-Wallace's theory. Wallace started to doubt the theory when he realized if you take the people who are supposedly savage from South America, or from Africa, or from Asia, those savages, and if you were to stick them into Cambridge University, they can do physics. And that does not make sense. Because they should only be as intelligent as their environment requires them to be. So he started to doubt the theory because it doesn't make sense for human beings. So he said the theory of natural selection explains all of life except humans. This is what Alfred Russel Wallace said. Darwin publicly said to him, publicly disassociated himself, and wrote to Wallace and said, don't murder our child, which is the Darwin's theory of evolution. Don't murder our child. It was extremely embarrassing that the co-author said the theory has this fatal flaw. And Wallace's name was wiped out from the history books, and no one remembers him. Everyone remembers Darwin. Okay, that's a good note to end upon. Jazakallah khair. And if you have any questions, my email is s.ahmad@iera.org. Or you can simply go to the IERA website and you can contact me from there if you have any questions. Jazakallah khair. I just thought it would be good to go to Birmingham.